Muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a una nueva actividad del Festival de Ideas Valparaíso, que este año celebra su 10º aniversario gracias al apoyo de Colbún, de Coopeuch, de Fundación Mar Adentro y el Ministerio de las Culturas. Soy Arturo Fontaine, soy escritor y a continuación conversaré con Salman Rushdie, escritor indo-británico, nacionalizado en Estados Unidos ahora, ganador del premio Max Booker, un escritor de fama mundial que ha escrito ya 14 novelas. Vamos a estar conversando sobre la última, que se llama El Quijote. En esta novela, El Quijote recorre Estados Unidos, es una novela de tipo road movie, digamos, recorre de California a Nueva York en busca de una Dulcinea que es una estrella de televisión, ¿no? Salman Rushdie tiene algo en común con El Quijote, así como El Quijote vive en las páginas de una novela y todo lo que toca se transforma en novela. Lo mismo ocurre con este extraordinario contador de historias que es Salman Rushdie. Muchas gracias por su atención. Salman, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be at least virtually in Chile.
Yes, it's wonderful to have you here again.
Yeah, I had hoped to be there in person, but the world does not.
It will happen soon, hopefully. This is the cover of the novel in the Spanish version, La edición de Seixoral. By the way, Salman, it's a very good translation.
I'm very glad to hear it. I'm very glad to hear it.
It's a very good translation, I think.
I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate in my translators. You know, they do a wonderful job, and I think it's worth saying that translation is the most undervalued art of literature, but one of the most important, because that allows us to talk across languages to each other. You know, and we live, I think, in an age of great translators.
That's true. That's true, and it's really an art because you have to recreate the work. And in this case, it's quite a challenge. It's not an easy novel to translate, but I thought it was very, very well done.
Okay.
Salman, in Cervantes' novel, in the second part, Don Quixote and Sancho criticize Avellaneda's novel, no, which was written. We don't know who wrote it. It's a pen name, but as you well known, of course, everybody knows Cervantes was not very happy with this fake Quixote. And there's a moment, for example, where Avellaneda tells us that Quixote went to Zaragoza, and Quixote decides not to go to Zaragoza precisely to contradict, to falsify Avellaneda's narrative. No? He's telling us lies. That's the now you do something similar. There's a fantastic trip of the author of the book, which is part of the book, and his son, which also belong in the novel. They are going from New York to California. It's like time is running backwards, I thought, and they are traveling to the places and situations that the author has already written about. But they behave in ways that contradict what has been written. And I thought that was fascinating. Why don't we talk about that? Because I don't recall, I must confess, I have not read the 14 novels by Salman Rushdie, but quite a few, 10, I think. But as far as I recall, this kind of metafictional move was not in your previous novels. So why don't you talk to us about that?
No, I never did it before. In fact, I slightly disapproved of it. You know,
is that so?
Yes, I would say to people, don't write a book about a writer writing a book. And just write the book, you know. And then I found myself doing it, and it was a surprise because it was not a part of the original design of the book. You know, when I first thought of the book, I thought it would simply be the story of this old fool, my version of Quixote, you know, my pharmaceutical salesman and his imaginary son, and their journey across America in search of this kind of delusional, impossible love, you know, of this TV star. And I thought that's fine. That's enough for the book. And during that journey, we learn about their relationship, the father-son relationship, and we also learn about the country they're traveling through. So and then I just began to write this other story about, which turned out to be the story of the author of the fiction that I thought I was writing. And I was quite uncertain about it to begin with. But it showed up. It showed up on my computer. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to see where this goes and to see if it's useful. But I gave myself permission at some point to say not useful and just to remove it all from the book. And then I kind of began to like it, and I liked the fact that it allowed me to talk about the way in which the creative act, the act of imagination, yes, it has its beginnings in personal experience, but by the time it's transformed and created as a fiction, it's different. It's not the same, So
yeah, and it changes the life of the author.
Yes. So the story of the author and his son is like the story of my fictional author and his fictional son, but but the story doesn't go the same way. It diverts, and that I enjoyed, the fact that these things the two narratives are echoes of each other, but they're not exact echoes of each other. They're variations of each other. And of course,
it's very difficult to make them converge because they gradually get together, no?
Yes. No, I mean, what I knew, and I was quite frightened by this, that by the end of the book, I had to somehow make the reader feel that the two stories are the same story.
Right.
That the two stories come together and join, and for a long time, I didn't know how to do that. I thought it's something I have to do, and I couldn't find the way exactly of doing it, and then in this last act of the novel, it develops a kind of science fictional element. And in the end, it was the science fiction that allowed me to solve the problem of how to bring them together.
That's fascinating. Yes, there's a science fiction dimension in the book, which is quite important. Maybe we'll go back to that. But you mentioned the father-son relationship. There are two father-son relationships. The Quijote's son is Sancho, and then the author and his son.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they are different because in the case of Quixote, he creates his son, and the question is, who is he going to be without the father? Yes. And that doesn't end so well. But the author father-son relationship is totally different. No, there's a moment I can read where he says the question was not who was son without him, but who was he without his son.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer was really not very much. So in the author's case, the son defines the identity of the man who happens to be his father. So to me, perhaps the core of the novel is the father-son relationship.
I'm glad you say this, because the novel is in many ways, it's playful and it's panoramic and so on. But I think the heart of it, the kind of emotional heart of it, is to do with family relationship, and the father-son relationships, the brother-sister relationships, because in both narratives, the central figure has a difficult relationship with a sister, and the question of whether that relationship can be healed and whether forgiveness is possible, these things are important in the book. So I think that is the emotional center of the book.
And the family secrets.
Exactly. And in my case, I have both good and bad experience of father-son relationships. That's to say, I'm happy to say that my relationships with my two sons are, so far pretty good. But my relationship as a son with my father was not so good. We were. I mean, it was all right when I was a little boy, and it was all right at the end of his life.
But there was the reconciliation at the end.
Yeah, but in the middle, there were a lot of difficulties between us. And so I wanted to talk about what it is that goes on between fathers and sons. And as you say, in one narrative, the father feels defined by the son, you know, and in the other narrative, in a way, the son exists only because of the father, you know. So they're opposite in a way.
And what in your view is the secret of a good father?
Oh, you know, learning from your mistakes on the whole. You know, not making the same mistakes over and over again.
Over and again. That's very good. There's a moment where Don Quixote arrives. Quixote, it's not Don. Yours is Quixote. Arrives to New York City, and he finds there chaos, you know, formless place, overcrowded, possessed. I'm reading of no normative narrative line. And Quixote finds on TV sitcoms, soap operas, reality shows, plots with satisfying conclusions. And he would like real life to be like that, to be formed by a story, and not just because the story for him gives meaning to the maelstrom of events, it seems. Now, does this hold for the sort of novels you write? Do stories somehow give meaning to events?
I think, yeah. I mean, I think otherwise, why do it? You know, I mean, it seems to me that real life is chaotic and in many ways formless. You know, and art is our way of placing form on what is otherwise chaotic, and to give it and by giving it shape, you give it meaning. You know, I think that's, this is the art of literature, you know. I mean, so in that sense, yeah, of course, it's what I hope to do. And it becomes harder because the world becomes not less chaotic, but more. See, you know, the comic idea in the novel that we live in the age of anything can happen, you know, I think it's literally true that enormous changes can happen overnight, almost. You know, and these are not just political changes; they're technological changes, and of course, as we experienced this year, the consequence of the disease, you know, which literally overnight changed the lives of everybody in the world, and is still doing so. So we do live in this incredibly fluid and metamorphic reality, you know, and it just seemed to me that classic realism is not able to cope with this, you know, because if you think about like the great age of the realist novel, if you think about Stendhal and Balzac and writers of this kind, in that time, there was a kind of agreement between the reader and the writer about what the world was like, you know, and realism grew out of that agreement. But when there is no longer that agreement, when we disagree radically about what the world is like, and one person's reality is another person's fake news, you know, then it becomes much more difficult to write that old-fashioned realist novel, you know, and that's why somewhere in the book the character says that surrealism in a way has become the most appropriate way to describe the world.
Right,
but it's
this is more
realistic. It's actually more real than realism.
Right. But in this world, would you say then that the plot is still crucial for the modern novel, or some people think that also the plot is something that is a bit?
You know, I've always been a plot person. You know, I know that there are people who think that the plot is very passé and unfashionable, and one should concentrate on form and language and character and you know, so on. But
Moods, etc.
I think that story is one of our oldest ways of understanding our lives. You know, and this is not just a question of writers. You know, all of us do this. We are this species that tells itself stories in order to try and understand the kind of creature that we are. You know, and some of these stories are true stories. Some of them are not true. Some of them are invented. Some of them are dishonest. but we live in this network of stories. And, you know, families have family stories, communities have community stories, nations have national stories. And so for me, story has always been necessary, you know, necessary. And the way I think about it is that the phrase, the thing I always say to myself is, if you're going to build a big car, put a big engine in it.
Well, the engine is the plot.
The engine is this plot, yes.
There's another moment in the novel where the author tries to explain to his son the picaresque tradition, the episodic nature of it, how the episodes of such a work could encompass many manners, high and low, etc. Could one consider this as a summary of Rushdie's aesthetics? Would you say these lines somehow express your poetics, your aesthetics project? Do you feel you belong in the picaresque tradition somehow?
Certainly in this novel, yes. I mean, I think this is one of the gifts that I was able to steal from Cervantes, you know.
Yes.
Because, of course, one of the great things about his novel is that it does change all the time. And there are stories inside stories. And, you know, sometimes it's comic, sometimes it's kind of melancholy, sometimes it's romantic. And it can go through many manners and many moods, you know. And I wanted to have something of that, because I felt that in order to understand the crazy world that we're in, I wanted to be able to use, in a way, all the techniques of the novel, you know, to use not just this or that technique, but to have a novel which could be in one moment comic, in another moment surrealist, in another moment absurdist, in another moment science fictional, and that it could the novel itself could constantly change in the way that the world is constantly changing, you know, and that's, I mean, the picaresque gives you that possibility.
On the other hand, you've always had, in my view, including even in the satanic verses, a comic manner, which I think is present in all your novels, certainly in Midnight Children and Shame and etc. And
you know, the funny thing is that until the satanic verses, everybody said that I was a funny writer. And then because of what happened around that book, people stopped thinking of me as a funny writer, you know, and it's taken a long time for them to notice it again.
Yeah, but I think it's pretty noticeable today. I mean, it's pretty evident.
Yeah, I think this book, I'm actually, one of the things that I'm happiest about is in the 1 year, just about 1 year since it came out in the English language, I've had a lot of people writing to me, telling me how funny they found it, you know, how humorous.
You laugh a lot. I mean, I laughed loud reading the book.
Because the worst thing of all is when a writer thinks he's being funny and he's not being funny.
Well, in Cervantes' novel, one of the best chapters, I think, is when Quijote is watching a puppet show and Lady Melisendra is kidnapped by a Moor. And Don Quixote attacks the Moor with his sword. No, he destroys the Moor, I mean the puppet, of course, and the whole puppet theater of Maese Pedro. Now, Don Quixote always has trouble distinguishing fact from fiction. He has no concept of fiction. He reads novels as books of history. But aren't we today living in a Quixotic world, in a sense, where the distinction between what is true and what is fake is getting blurred?
I mean, that, you know, that really was one of the starting points for the book, you know, to say that if we do live in that world where people find it harder to distinguish truth from lies, you know, the real from the invented, that's a kind of madness, you know, and it's a very quixotic madness.
That's right. That's right.
and we are now, in a way, we are all Don Quixote, you know, because we all suffer from this difficulty of distinguishing facts from fiction, you know. Although I should say, you know, I wanted to make this point that, because people say now, sometimes I've had people say to me that in this age of lies, you know, why do you go on writing fiction? Because you're just adding to the lies. And I just want to argue that there is a difference between fiction and lies. That's to say that the art of literature is a way of approaching the truth by whatever means, but the techniques don't matter, but the intention of literature is to tell the truth about human beings and what we're like and what we do to each other and so on. Whereas the lie is a way of obscuring the truth, so actually literature and lies are enemies, they're the opposite of each other, and should not be confused. But anyway, yes, we do live in this crazy age. And again, it's not, I think it's not even, in its origin, it's not to do with political leaders telling lies. It has to do with this new so-called information age that we have created, in which, in fact, there is more disinformation than information. And it, to put it in the Cervantes way, it drives us mad.
Well, there's a moment when one of the characters, Jack, makes very sort of grim comments about social media, like they have no memory. Today's scandal is sufficient for them. They're taking us back to, I don't know, the lynch mob, the public burning, etc. Do you feel like that about social media?
Many days I do, yes. I mean the character in the novel who says that is a judge, and he's a rather old-fashioned person, so he speaks from that position. But I do think that we are in danger of being destroyed by these media that we have created. That they create a mentality of in which it becomes much easier to hate people, in which hostility becomes normative. And all of which is hidden behind the cloak of anonymity, because almost everybody is using a pseudonym. I mean, this is a novel in which the characters are all using pseudonyms too.
Yes. Why did you do that?
Well, partly in order to talk about this moment we live in, where we all have pseudonyms.
You mean in Twitter, for example?
Twitter, for example, everybody lives behind a veil. We have a mask which we put on when we go into the electronic world to communicate. And so I thought I would also have characters who take on pseudonyms. In the case of my Quichote, he wants to write love letters to this lady that he is obsessed by, but he knows that it's probably a good idea not to say too much about himself initially, because she could call the police. So he uses the pseudonym for that reason. And other people have stage names and so on. So I wanted to explore this thing about what happens when we live behind the masks of other names.
Why do you think is that? Why are we into this?
It's just, this is the way in which these media developed. I think they would be very different if everybody was obliged to use their own name. I think if on things like Twitter and so on, you had people's real names and they were identifiable, I think the discourse would be different.
Would be different. So in a sense, it's a way of hiding. In the novel, although we talked about it, the novel is written as Cervantes' novel in a comic mood. It's in the end, it's a dystopia. I mean, the planet is about to collapse.
Yes, yes. I found myself writing an end of the world novel. I mean, the end of the world novel is a form with a long history of its own. People have been writing about the end of the world for a very long time, and the world somehow doesn't end. And what I began to think is that when one writes a novel which raises the subject of the possibility of the end of the world, you're not really writing about the end of the world. You're writing about some kind of a crisis in the world in which you live, and maybe you're talking about the end of a world, the end of a kind of world that you have known and been familiar with. And I feel that quite a lot of the time. I feel that the world that I have lived in all my life and have understood, or thought I understood, is changing. And many things about that world are coming to an end, and I'm not exactly sure what the next world will be like, and or how easy it will be for somebody like me to inhabit that world. And so that's what I thought I was in the end writing about. I was writing about the end of one reality, the end of a familiar reality and its replacement by something else not yet fully defined.
Now, this science fiction dimension, which is so vivid, which very powerful images and all these, this somehow the reality breaks and disappears. They're like holes. I mean, it's very it's persuasive as a challenge to the world. I mean, you started writing how about this? How did? Because image is very original, I thought.
I've always been very interested in science fiction because I think, first of all, I think it's a wonderful medium for the discussion of ideas. I think the best science fiction is what Margaret Atwood uses a different term. She calls it speculative fiction, and I think that science fiction is very good at that, at speculating about ideas and possibilities, and that's, I think, one of the best reasons for using it as in one's writing. Also, of course, I mean, I've always been, a kind of movie freak, and the cinema in our time, in the post-Star Wars era, has been almost remade by science fiction and fantasy. So it comes naturally to me sometimes, And in my very earliest writings, I was experimenting with science fiction, and then I went on to other things, and then I seem to have found my way back. Because when I was thinking about the difficulties of this book and the obstacles in it, it really was a couple of science fiction short stories that I had read maybe 50 years ago that came back into my mind and that showed me how to solve the problems of the book. And I mean, this is, of course, one of the wonderful things about being a writer is that literally something that is buried in your mind that you haven't ever thought about for half a century can suddenly reappear when you need it and help you. So there's a story by American science fiction writer Catherine MacLean called Pictures Don't Lie. And there's a story by the British science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke called The 9 Billion Names of God. And both those stories were in some way very helpful to me in telling me how I should write the book.
Right, then they came back after so many years.
Yeah, when I literally had never thought about them. The stories that I read when I was at university and maybe 20, 21 years old.
Amazing. Salman, do you know the end before, or you discover it while you write usually?
I don't know. It's different with each. There have been books where I have been very, very clear about the ending, and that has remained the ending. I mean, for example, The Moor's Last Sigh was a book of that kind, where I was almost from the first page, I knew what the last page would be, and in fact, one of the earliest things I wrote was the last paragraph, and then when I got there, it turned out that really was the life. With very small changes, it actually was the last paragraph. So in that case, yeah, but
fascinating.
In this case, no. In this case, no. I mean, as I say, I knew that I had to somehow bring these two storylines together. And for a long time, I wasn't clear how to do it. So I had to. So the writing the novel also was an act of discovery. It was an act of discovering the novel. And I find that my writing has changed a little bit in this way, that when I was much younger, I needed a much more worked out architecture. I needed to have the shape, the skeleton, so to speak, before I could start putting flesh on it. And nowadays I find I'm more willing to see it as the act of creation, as an act of discovery, that you find out what you're doing by doing it. And the way I think about it is that it's that earlier way, that very constructed way of writing, seems to me to correspond to Western classical music, to symphonies and so on. Whereas this way of writing seems to correspond much more to jazz. Where there is some sort of structure, but within that structure, there's a large amount of room left for the musician for the performer to discover the direction he's going in. When Miles Davis picks up his horn, he doesn't exactly know what noise he's going to make until he makes it.
Fascinating. And doesn't that make you feel anxious while you don't know where you're going?
Yeah, it's terrifying. but it's a good terrifying, because it challenges you, and it makes you constantly criticize yourself, because of course one of the aspects of this kind of writing which allows for improvisation is that you must be able to say to yourself, okay, that doesn't work, that it was worth trying, but actually it doesn't work. I need to find another solution.
Do you write a lot?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, I hope that I don't, that most of the time the decisions I make are useful and right. But of course, there are times when you go down a blind alley and you think you might write 10 or 20 or even 30 or 40 pages. Then you think, no, I don't want to be here. This is the wrong place to be. So I have to back up and go through another door.
There are many, many literary allusions or references in the book. There's a wonderful passage. I laughed a lot with it, where although there's a dark meaning behind it, that take place in New Jersey, where people are turning into mastodons.
Yeah.
In a way, so it's a way to reimagine, of course, UNESCO's Rhinoceros. Why don't you tell us a bit about that? This is one of the funniest moments in the book, I think.
This was one of the scenes which illustrates what I'm saying about discovery, because again, I had not really intended that scene to be there. It simply arrived. And where it came from was that, again, a long time ago, when I was at Cambridge University, when I was 20 years old, I acted in a student production of UNESCO's Rhinoceros. Yes. I mean, I wasn't the lead character or anything. I was just one of the people in this small town who are turning into rhinoceroses,
So you were a rhinoceros.
I was. Yeah, I became one. And I remember at that young age not fully understanding the play, and I remember saying to the director, what is this about? What is happening? And the director very gently said to me, he said, Salman, it's about fascism. And then I said, how is it about fascism? And he said, it's about what can happen in a town or in a country when suddenly your next door neighbors, people whose children were playing with your children yesterday, suddenly they turn into monsters. Suddenly people that you have lived with become so alien to you that you can't recognize them, and they're actually frightening to you. And then you fear that others may turn into these monsters, and that you yourself may turn into a monster, and that's what it's about. And I said, oh, yeah, that's very good. And so then when I came to the passage in the novel when they're coming closer to New York and the climaxes are about to take place, I thought, maybe, sadly, maybe we are again in a moment of that kind, where the divisions in our society are so deep that we begin to seem alien to each other, that we begin to see each other as monstrous, as rhinoceroses. And I thought, well, okay, then I can pay a little homage to UNESCO by in this scene, but I can't have rhinoceroses because he already has rhinoceroses. So instead, I'll have pink elephants.
These mastodons. As I think the audience already knows, because of what you've been telling us, the novel, of course, is about our world. It's about how we are here. Do you feel today more as an American writer or as an Indian, British? How do you sort out this?
It goes back and forth. I mean, I've now written a sequence of novels which have primarily been set, almost entirely been set in the United States.
You've been living in America, what, 15, 20 years? I don't know.
21 years now, 21 years. So it not surprisingly, America has become a big subject for me. And I mean, I started a long time ago with my novel Fury, which came out in 2001, which was a novel about somebody just arriving in America, which is also what I had just done. You know, and since then I've tried many different literary forms to try and get to grips with American life. You know, so in 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights, I tried to use a kind of 1001 Nights fairy tale quality, you know, and in The Golden House, that's a more naturalistic novel, and then this one is like, as I said, is like everything at once. It's like every conceivable technique. But what I did feel this time was, after having lived here for 2 decades, I felt ready to do something which was panoramic, which wasn't just set in New York City in a neighborhood that I knew very well, but was actually about an attempt to take in a broader reality, you know, a reality of the country as a whole. And now, right now, at this minute, having done that, I feel maybe I've written enough American novels for a bit, you know. And right now, I find myself thinking about India again, and you know, the novel that I'm just beginning to write just now is set in India again. So you know, it goes back and forth.
Fascinating. And given that you are so close to what's happening, what would you say is how do you do it to avoid being, so to speak, consumed by the moment, by the present moment? How do you do it as an artist to capture your moment, but without making it disappear after a week or so?
Exactly. Well, that's the challenge. The challenge of writing about the present moment, you know, is that if you're not careful, then your novel becomes very quickly like yesterday's newspapers, you know, and irrelevant. But if you do it better than that, then you can actually capture the moment in some way which is permanent, you know. And I think there are many great books which have successfully tried to do that. I mean, The Great Gatsby is a book like that, you know, which was criticized when it came out for being too ephemeral, you know, but which has proved to be, you know, immortal by capturing that moment. And so I thought, it's risky, you know, it's creatively a dangerous thing to do, but maybe that's the reason to do it, you know. And again, there's a thing I remember from one of Hemingway's bullfighting stories. I can't remember which one now, where he has this idea. He says the greatest matador works closest to the bull. That if the bull is far away, you know, it's not very dangerous and it's not very exciting. If the bull is brushing your thigh as it goes past you, then every move you make has to be precise. Otherwise you have a horn in your side, you know. And it struck me that this business of writing up against the present moment, it's like that. It's like you're working very close to the bull, you know. And if you do it right, then everybody applauds. You know? And if you do it wrong, then you have a very big hole in your side.
Right, and the novel disappears.
And the novel disappears. Exactly.
Right.
And one of the things about this is that it's impossible to be certain if you have succeeded or not, you know, because time will tell. I mean, I remember a long time ago now, almost 40 years ago, when I finished writing Midnight's Children. The climax of that novel has to do with something that had been taking place when I was writing the end of that novel, which was this period which was known as the emergency, when Indira Gandhi suspended democracy for like 2.5 years or something. And I remember thinking to myself, there will be a time in the future when nobody cares about this. You know, when the emergency is not a big issue, and even Indira Gandhi is not a big issue. And I remember thinking, well, at that point, the novel will either get worse because it will be damaged by the loss of topicality, you know, or the novel will get better because its underlying strengths, novelistic strengths, will become, in a way, more clear, more visible because of the loss of topicality. And I remember thinking, I really don't know which of those things will happen. I had no idea, you know. And now, 40 years later, I guess one might be able to say that I had the good result, not the bad result, you know.
Well, absolutely.
So you do your best to do something which has that underlying novelistic strength of character and idea and language and form. And then you hope that that will create something which is of lasting value, you know, and not just ephemeral.
But if I recall, in that novel, at the end, isn't there an election? I mean, the political situation changes in the novel. And I think that had to do also with what happened, really.
Yeah. No, I mean, I remember when I was writing the book, that election hadn't happened, you know, and I didn't know how to, I thought I can't end the emergency in the novel if it has not ended in the world, you know,
Right.
and then when Mrs. Gandhi called the election, mistakenly thinking that she would win and therefore legitimize what she had done, and instead she was very heavily defeated. I remember feeling grateful to her because she gave me the end of my book.
He gave you the end. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, I think we are approaching the end of this wonderful conversation. We could go on and on and on. What I would like ask you, if you could please read us the first lines of the book of Quixote, because I think that the tone and rhythm of Cervantes is so well captured. I think we have a good English translation. I don't know if you agree. E.D. Grossman translation is pretty good.
Wonderful.
Don't you agree?
Yes. I mean, the best translation there has so far been, I think.
I think that when Nabokov didn't like Quijote, no, he wrote very nasty things about the book. I think he was. I think the translation was a problem. I think.
I remember when I first read the book, what was then the standard translation, the Penguin Modern Classics translation, was really quite dull. It didn't have the magic of the original, you know. And for a long time, therefore, I didn't completely understand why this book is so revered, you know. And now that there are better translations, particularly the Grossman translation, the book is much better represented in English. That's, you know, what we said at the very beginning, the absolute importance of translators, you know, and Edith Grossman's book gives you the sense of Don Quixote as being almost a contemporary fiction, you know. And
that's wonderful. Yeah.
And I mean, I really am.
In a sense, the book is a contemporary fiction.
Well, I'm with Borges' Pierre Menard also, but I wasn't trying to write that kind of Quixote.
No, but really, as we'll hear in a moment, the lines that you wrote have the rhythm and the tone of the original, which I thought is amazing.
Is also the beginning is a little homage to the master, you know. So I have to put on my reading glasses.
Yes.
So, all right. So this is chapter 1. Quixote, an old man, falls in love, embarks on a quest, and becomes a father. There once lived, as a series of temporary addresses across the United States of America, a traveling man of Indian origin, advancing years, and retreating mental powers, who, on account of his love for mindless television, had spent far too much of his life in the yellow light of tawdry motel rooms, watching in excess of it, and had suffered a peculiar form of brain damage as a result. He devoured morning shows, daytime shows, late night talk shows, soaps, situation comedies, Lifetime movies, hospital dramas, police series, vampire and zombie serials, the dramas of housewives from Atlanta, New Jersey, Beverly Hills, and New York, the romances and quarrels of hotel fortune princesses, the cavortings of individuals made famous by happy nudities, the 15 minutes of fame accorded to young persons with large social media followings on account of their plastic surgery acquisition of a third breast, or their post-rib removal figures that mimicked the impossible shape of the Mattel company's Barbie doll, or even more simply, their ability to catch giant carp in picturesque settings while wearing only the tiniest of string bikinis.
Fantastic.
It goes on that way. That's maybe enough.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
Salman.
So happy to be with you.